Welcome. Thank you for joining us from DC today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
So, early voting starts in just a few days, but more than a third of Democratic voters in polls say they're undecided. What do voters need to know about you? Why do you deserve their vote?
Well, I just want Democrats and anyone who's going to be participating in this primary to know who I am, to know my story, that I was born and raised in Dallas by a single mom who was a public school teacher, that played at Baylor, made it to the NFL, became a voting rights lawyer, and have served in Congress in a way that's shown that I will both stand up for my values as someone who's been a voting rights lawyer and a big protector of democracy, but also try to find ways to bring us together. And I'm proud that I've been the most bipartisan member of the Texas delegation. And I want to be a senator now for this state that's given me so much. And so I want to have their support. I want to make sure they know who I am. And hopefully on March 5th, we'll see that.
For those people, immigration has been a top concern. You've talked about the need for comprehensive immigration reform. So have the other candidates in this race. But for you, what does comprehensive immigration reform mean? What policies does that really entail?
Yeah. Well, I think it has to be bipartisan. And I'm signed on to and worked with Veronica Escobar on a bipartisan bill called the Dignity Act that I think is a really good way forward for us to show that we can do a number of things at once. Number one, we have to secure the border. That's something that every country has to do, and this bill would allow us to do that. But we also need to better match our immigration system to meet the needs of our economy. And that's something I hear from employers all the time. And we want to be a country that can still attract and retain the top talent from around the world. And with our broken system right now, it's making it harder for us to do that. And then, of course, we need to have a pathway out of the shadows for folks who've been here who are undocumented to find a way forward for them, and particularly to protect our dreamers. To me, those are the kind of three pillars of what we know a bipartisan immigration reform is going to look like. We haven't done comprehensive reform since the Reagan era. It's time for us to get that done now.
Drilling down there, your opponent, Roland Gutierrez, has criticized you for joining Republicans to condemn President Biden's handling of the border. How do you respond to that criticism?
Well, I think that in that vote, I was saying that I can't stand for the status quo, that I don't think it's acceptable. And when we have a record number of crossings, as we did last December, we know that something has to change. And I think that for us, as Texans, we have to acknowledge that there is a crisis, and now we have to respond to it. We don't have to respond by being inhumane or by being brutal, but we do have to do something. And that's where my biggest criticism is of Senator Cruz, which is that he wants to talk about the problem at the border, but he doesn't want to actually solve it. When he had a chance recently here in the United States Senate to have a bipartisan deal to try and address what was happening at the border, he didn't want to vote for it, not because of the policy, but because he wants to have the political issue to run on in November. I'll never put politics over what's best for our state when I'm in the Senate.
Gun violence is now the leading cause of death for children in our country. As a potential senator from this state, how do you see yourself advancing gun safety measures?
Well, I'm also a father of a 5 and nearly 3-year-old, and this is something that I think every parent thinks about constantly, is how can we protect our kids? And I'm also a 4th-generation Texan. I recognize and have grown up around folks who taught me about responsible gun ownership. I think that's who we are as Texans. But we have to get back to that. And we have to have some, I think, common sense and broadly supported bipartisan ideas that can allow us to both reduce gun violence and also respect the Second Amendment and understanding who we are as Texans and our values. And to me, that begins with universal background checks, doing something about high-capacity magazines, raising the age to purchase a semi-automatic rifle, and putting in place red flag laws for folks who have been found to be a danger to themselves or others. These are all common sense ideas that we know we can get done right now and can build on what we did after the tragedy in Uvalde with the Safer Communities Act, which was for the first time in 30 years, we did do something at the federal level to try to address gun violence.
If you were sitting in the Oval Office right now with President Biden, what would you recommend he do about the civilian death toll in Gaza and the risk of wider war in the Middle East?
Well, I think the President and the Secretary of State are working very hard right now to try and find a solution that leads to a ceasefire of some kind in exchange for the release of hostages and an agreement that leaves Hamas no longer in a position to be able to conduct an attack like they did on October 7th. But I am, like everyone, heartbroken about when you see civilian casualties in Gaza, just as I was heartbroken about what happened to the Israeli people on October 7th, which was the deadliest day for the Jewish people since the Holocaust. And we have to find, I think, as our role as the United States is to help shape what comes next, both in Gaza and for a potential Palestinian state. And that, to me, has to be the end goal, that we have a peaceful and independent Palestinian state next to a safe, secure, stable, democratic, and Jewish state in Israel. That, to me, has to be the end state that we try to work towards.
Switching gears, abortion is essentially banned in Texas right now. If you are elected to the Senate, what steps would you be willing to take to codify abortion access?
Well, my wife and I have been blessed with two beautiful baby boys that we had in Dallas in the last 5 years. And I just can't imagine if at one of our appointments, and I was at every single important one, after an ultrasound or genetic test, the doctor would come in and said, there's a problem with the baby or the pregnancy. But there's nothing I can do because politicians have decided that they know better. And you're going to have to try and flee our state. And that's happening to far too many Texas women. We've seen 26,000 women, according to the Houston Chronicle, in Texas who've given birth to their rapist's child. This is unacceptable. It's an attack on our freedoms. We have counties saying that you can't drive through the county if you're going to use the roads to access an abortion. That's not who we are as Texans. We believe in freedom. And when I'm in the United States Senate, I will restore this right and make sure that we go back to the standard that we had for the last 50 years. We know that Ted Cruz wants to have a national ban on abortion, and we can't allow that.
Healthcare access in general is a very important topic to many Texans. Do you favor or oppose creation of a single payer system, often referred to as Medicare for all?
Well, healthcare is personal for all of us, and I want to make sure that Texas is no longer the state that leads the country with the highest uninsured rate. It's outrageous what's happening in our state, that we haven't expanded Medicaid, and we have so many of our fellow Texans who don't have insurance, or even those who do have it who can't afford the prescription drugs that they need to survive. And I'm really proud of the work that I've done in Congress to try and expand coverage and lower costs, particularly when it comes to capping the cost of insulin for folks on Medicare at $35 a month and capping their out-of-pocket costs at $2,000 a year. To me, that's a huge benefit for our folks on Medicare. I want to extend some of those savings to everyone else. Unfortunately, Ted Cruz opposed that and didn't allow us to control the cost of insulin. But when I'm in the Senate, we'll get that done. And to me, we have to build on the Affordable Care Act, expand coverage and lower costs so that every Texan gets access to quality and affordable health care.
I want to ask you about this next thing. Republican presidential candidate Nikki Haley says politicians over 75 should be required to take mental competency tests. Do you agree, and should we have term limits for Congress the way we do for the presidency?
Well, I'm a proud member of the Congressional Black Caucus, and when I was elected, I went to our first Black Caucus lunch and walked into a room full of giants who have served our country over decades, like John Lewis and like the recently departed my dear friend Eddie Bernice Johnson. These are folks who use their experience and also use their life experiences, I think, to help us craft better legislation. Their voices are important, but to me, when I hear discussions around term limits, what I understand it to be is a frustration that at times we can't get rid of incumbents who are no longer doing the job or who are no longer as active and able to do the job as they were. And to me, we can help solve that by having voting reform so that we make it easier to vote and ban partisan gerrymandering. We shouldn't have that in our state or in our country. In my opinion, it produces more extreme politicians and worse results. But also by addressing our campaign finance system to make it so that we level the playing field a bit and get big money out of our politics. To me, that's the more responsible way forward for us to have both good governance and good and better elected officials.
A timely topic for many Texans. This week marks 3 years since the deadly winter storm of 2021 here and the prolonged blackouts that happened. While a number of reforms got enacted at the state level in the wake of that, what role do you think the federal government should play in creating a more reliable power grid in Texas?
Well, let's be very clear. When I'm in the Senate, if we have a statewide crisis, I will not go on vacation. I will not go to Cancun, and I certainly won't make jokes about it. When hundreds of Texans died and thousands of Texans experienced incredible disruption of their lives, every Texan knows where we were during that crisis. Every Texan remembers what it was like when the energy leader in the world couldn't keep the lights on. And so we need to have a senator who cares about us enough that when a crisis hits, we spring into action. That's what I did at the time. I was going to food bank and trying to do everything I could to work with FEMA and our county emergency officials to try and find buildings that had power on, that we could just call them warming centers. And so we have to have a senator who will actually do the work. And Ted Cruz has shown that he won't. But there is some federal role to play here, even though our state grid is not on the federal system. And part of that was, when I voted for the infrastructure bill, was to bring billions of dollars to our state to help us strengthen our grid, strengthen our transmission, and try and make it incentivize us to no longer have a situation like this ever happen. Unfortunately, Ted Cruz also voted against that bill as well. So we can do better as a senator, somebody who will actually care about all 30 million Texans.
And specifically, do you think federal legislation is needed to require interconnection with the nation's other two power grids?
Well, I don't think to me, that's not a federal decision per se, although I think that we have to make sure that we're providing the funding that's necessary to avoid a crisis like this and to incentivize the behavior that we want, which is to make sure that if something like this does happen again, that the gas lines don't freeze, that we have weatherizing in place. I wish that our state elected officials had been more focused on that ahead of time. We had warnings about this. This is something that the federal regulators had mentioned could happen based on some previous experiences that we had. This did not come out of the blue, but due to, I think, inaction at the state level, it did happen. So I will do everything I can at the federal level to make sure that I keep Texans' lights on. We need to make sure we have elected officials at the state level as well who will do the same.
You know, there is a lot of concern about the state of democracy, and many people of all political beliefs think that the country is on the wrong path, and our elected leaders get a lot of that blame. To any Texan watching, why are you the candidate that they should put their trust in?
Well, I'm not a career politician. I'm a former NFL linebacker and a lawyer and somebody who's a fourth-generation Texan, and I think I know who we are, we're not who Ted Cruz says we are. We're not as divided as he makes us out to be. We're not as divided as you see on cable news at night. That's not the Texas that I know. The Texas that I know is one that helped a kid who was raised by a single mom chase his version of the American dream, going to my local YMCA, relying on my teachers and my coaches. We are a state that can come together and do incredibly big things. But we have to have leadership in place that understands that and tries to nurture that, not that tries to pit us against each other. And unfortunately, Ted Cruz has been doing that for 12 years, and we can't afford 6 more years of it. So I'm asking for folks' support, asking for your vote, and I want to serve you in the United States Senate.
Thank you very much for being with us today.
Thanks.